They were all laughing when the glass hit the floor, but he wasn't, because Vincent Moretti had built his empire on noticing the things everyone else ignored, and in that single moment beneath the golden lights of his downtown restaurant, he saw what no one else did. Naomi Carter froze, just for a second, her hand trembling, as the tray slipped from her grip, crystal shattering across polished marble like it didn't belong there, like she didn't belong there. And when she reached down to gather the pieces, her sleeve slid back just enough for the truth to breathe. Dark bruises wrapped quietly around her wrist, not loud, not dramatic, just there, like something that had been waiting to be seen. And then just as quickly, she pulled the fabric down, covering it with the same practiced motion she used to cover everything else. The room kept moving. Forks clinked against plates. A man at table 12 complained about his steak. A couple near the window laughed over wine, as if pain didn't exist in places like this. As if pain had rules about where it was allowed to show up. But Vincent didn't move. He stood still, watching from the mezzanine above, fingers resting lightly against the railing, his expression unchanged, but his eyes locked on her. Because he had seen fear before, he had seen people hide things before, but this was different. This wasn't panic, this was control, the kind built from surviving too many days. No one should have to survive. Naomi stood up straight again, shoulders squared, chin lifted, apology already on her lips as she moved to clean the mess, like nothing had happened, like nothing ever happened. And for everyone else that was enough, it always was. But Vincent kept watching the way she avoided using her right hand, the way her smile arrived half a second too late, the way she flinched, not from noise, but from proximity, like her body had memorized something it wished it could forget. And still the room didn't notice, because the room didn't need to notice. The room paid to feel comfortable. Not aware, but Vincent Moretti had never been interested in comfort. He was interested in truth, and truth had just slipped out from under a sleeve and tried to hide itself again. He exhaled slowly, one breath measured, controlled, as the city lights bled through the tall windows behind him, casting long shadows across the dining floor. And in that quiet second, something shifted, not loudly, not violently, just a decision forming in the space between what he saw and what he refused to ignore. Because men like him didn't step in for small things, not unless those small things meant something more. And as Naomi disappeared into the back hallway, carrying a fresh tray, like nothing had ever happened, Vincent turned his head slightly, eyes following her path. And for the first time that night, the room around him faded away, leaving only one thought, clear and unshakable. She said nothing, but he already knew she was not fine. The restaurant moved on, as if nothing had happened, because that is what places like this were designed to do: absorb discomfort, polish it into silence, and keep the illusion intact. Naomi Carter stepped through the kitchen doors into a different world, where heat replaced elegance and orders replaced laughter. Steam rose in soft clouds around her as cooks shouted times and plates slid across stainless steel counters. But even here, she stayed quiet, moving with careful precision, like every step had already been measured long before she took it. She rinsed her hands under warm water for a second longer than necessary, then adjusted her sleeve again, making sure it sat exactly where it needed to be, not too tight, not too loose, just enough to keep questions away. She checked the mirror, hanging crooked near the storage rack, her face calm, her expression steady, the same practiced calm she wore every night, the kind that made people comfortable because it asked for nothing in return. And then she picked up another tray, because the shift was not over, and neither was she. Out on the floor, nothing had changed. The pianist in the corner played something soft and familiar. Glasses caught the light, like small stars, and conversations flowed without interruption. A man in a tailored suit snapped his fingers for service. A woman complained about the temperature of her wine, and Naomi responded the same way she always did, with a nod, with a quiet apology, with a voice that never rose above what was necessary. She moved from table to table, never rushing, never lingering, her presence almost invisible, except for the way everything seemed to run smoother when she was there. And yet beneath that rhythm, there was something else, a hesitation so subtle it could only be noticed by someone looking for it. The way she shifted weight from one foot to the other to avoid pressure, the way she kept her right arm closer to her body, the way her smile appeared like a habit instead of a feeling. Vincent remained above, watching, not constantly, not obviously, but enough. His world had taught him that patterns told stories, and Naomi Carter was a pattern that did not match the room she worked in. She did not chase tips, she did not flirt for favor, she did not complain when shifts ran late. And when a customer offered her $100 bill for a small kindness, she politely declined, as if accepting it would cost her more than it was worth. That detail stayed with him, because in his experience, people who had nothing did not turn down money unless something else was holding them in place, something stronger than need. Later that night, near closing time, Vincent stepped down from the mezzanine, his shoes quiet against the marble as he crossed the floor. Conversations dimmed, just slightly, not out of fear, but out of awareness. People always noticed when he moved, even if they did not understand why. He stopped near the service station, where Naomi was organizing receipts, her posture straight, her focus on the numbers, as if they mattered more than anything else. He did not speak right away. He simply stood there long enough for her to feel it, the shift in the air, the presence behind her. And when she finally looked up, her eyes met his just for a second before dropping again, respectful, controlled, distant. And in that second, he saw it, not weakness, not fragility, but restraint, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy without letting it show. And Vincent understood something, then, not fully, not completely, but enough to know this was not an accident. This was not a single bad day. This was a story that had been unfolding long before he noticed, and the room around them continued, as always, unaware, untouched, unchanged. But for him, the illusion had already broken. And once something like that breaks, it never goes back to the way it was. It was nearly closing when the city outside began to quiet down, but inside the restaurant the rhythm softened rather than stopped. Plates moved slower, voices dropped lower, and the golden light felt warmer, like the night itself was exhaling. Naomi stepped out through the back door for exactly 3 minutes, not a second more, not a second less, because she had learned to measure her breaks the same way she measured everything else, controlled, limited, careful. The alley behind the restaurant smelled faintly of rain and metal, the kind of place no one important ever looked, and that was precisely why she chose it. A boy stood near the corner, no older than 16, wearing a thin jacket that did not match the chill in the air, his hands tucked into his sleeves, as if warmth could be borrowed. Naomi approached without hesitation, her steps lighter, now quieter in a different way. She handed him a small paper bag, the same one she had set aside hours earlier, her own meal, untouched. The boy looked at her with a mixture of relief and guilt, like someone who knew he was asking too much. Without saying a word, she smiled, not wide, not bright, but real enough to soften the space between them. "You have to eat," she said gently, her voice losing the formal edge she carried inside. He nodded, taking the bag carefully, like it was something fragile, something that could disappear if held too loosely. And for a moment, she reached out, adjusting his collar, just slightly, a small gesture almost maternal, before pulling her hand back quickly, as if remembering something, as if even kindness had limits. Vincent watched from the shadow, just inside the doorway, unseen, unannounced, his presence quiet but intentional. He had followed, without making a sound, not out of suspicion, but out of certainty, because patterns always led somewhere. And now he saw it, not just the bruises, not just the restraint, but the reason behind it. She was not enduring for herself, she was enduring for someone else. That realization settled heavily, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like a weight finding its place. The boy thanked her, and she shook her head softly, as if gratitude was unnecessary, as if this exchange was not a favor, but a responsibility. Then she checked her watch, exactly 3 minutes. She turned and walked back inside, her posture shifting again, her shoulders straightening, her expression resetting like a switch had been flipped. And by the time she crossed the threshold, she was once again the waitress everyone expected, efficient, polite, invisible. Vincent remained where he was for a second longer, the cool air brushing against his face, his eyes still on the empty corner where the boy had stood, and something in him moved, not anger, not yet, but recognition, the kind that does not ask permission, the kind that changes what comes next, because now the story was no longer hidden. It had shape, it had purpose, and most importantly, it had a line that should never have been crossed. And as Vincent stepped back into the light of his own restaurant, he understood something with absolute clarity. Whatever Naomi Carter was carrying, she was not carrying it alone anymore. Vincent did not call her name right away, because men like him understood timing, and timing was everything. The last table had just left. The final glass had been polished, and the soft music had faded into silence, leaving only the low hum of lights above and the distant sound of traffic outside. Naomi stood at the service station, aligning receipts into a neat stack, her movements precise, as if order could protect her from anything that waited beyond those walls. Then his voice came, calm, controlled, cutting through the quiet. "Naomi." She froze, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone else, but to him it was there, that half-second pause before she turned around. "Yes, sir," her tone respectful, steady. "The Same voice she used with every guest, but this time it felt different, because she knew this was not about a table, not about an order, not about anything routine. Vincent stepped closer, not too close, just enough to make the space between them intentional, his hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, his gaze level, not harsh, not soft, just certain. You dropped a tray earlier, he said simply. Naomi nodded. I am sorry, it will not happen again. He shook his head once, slow, deliberate. That is not what I asked. The room felt smaller, then not physically, but in the way silence can close in around two people. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer than before, then looked down, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the paper stack. It was an accident, she said quietly. The same practiced answer, the same shield. Vincent studied her, not searching for the truth because he already knew it, but watching how far she would go to protect the lie. You always take your break at the same time, he continued, his voice even almost conversational. 3 minutes exactly every night. Naomi did not respond, her breath shallow but controlled. And tonight you gave your meal away, he added, the words landing gently but with weight. She looked up, then surprise breaking through the calm just for a moment before she caught it again. I do not know what you mean, she said, but the sentence lacked strength, lacked conviction. Vincent straightened slightly, not in dominance, but in decision. You can stop, he said quietly, the words not loud, not sharp, but final. You do not have to pretend here. Something in the air shifted, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. Naomi stood still, her eyes fixed somewhere between him and the floor, like she was choosing between silence and something far more dangerous. And when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost careful. I am fine, she repeated the same 2 words, but this time they sounded different, thinner, like they could break if touched. Vincent did not interrupt, did not push, did not raise his voice, because pressure would only make her retreat further, and he understood that people who carried this kind of weight did not let go easily, not for strangers, not for anyone. He nodded once, as if accepting her answer even though he did not believe it, then reached into his jacket and placed a small card on the counter between them. No logo, no explanation, just a number. If anything changes, he said, his tone steady. You call that number day or night? Naomi looked at the card, but did not touch it. Her hands remained where they were, as if even reaching for help required permission. She had not yet given herself. Vincent turned to leave, then paused just for a fraction of a second without looking back. No one here is going to ask you to hide anything, he said quietly. And with that he walked away, leaving the space behind him heavier than before, not with fear, but with possibility. And Naomi stood there staring at the card, the silence pressing in around her, because for the first time in a long time someone had seen through the lie, and instead of turning away, he had chosen to stay. Naomi did not take the card that night. She left it exactly where he had placed it, as if touching it would make everything real, as if accepting it would mean admitting something she had spent years refusing to say out loud. The restaurant closed, the lights dimmed, and one by one the staff filtered out into the quiet street, but she stayed behind a little longer, finishing small tasks that did not need to be finished, wiping surfaces that were already clean, aligning chairs that were already straight, because routine gave her something solid to hold on to when everything else felt uncertain. When she finally stepped outside, the air had turned colder, the kind that settles into your bones if you stand still too long. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and walked the same route she always walked, counting steps without thinking, passing the same storefronts, the same flickering streetlight, the same empty bus stop where the boy sometimes waited. But tonight it was empty, and that absence lingered longer than it should have. By the time she reached her building, the city had gone quiet in that way that feels heavier than noise. The hallway inside smelled faintly of old paint and something worn down over time. She climbed the stairs slowly, not because she was tired, but because each step carried a weight she could not explain. When she reached her door, she paused for a moment, her hand resting against the handle, her eyes closing briefly as if preparing for something unseen. Then she stepped inside. The apartment was small, just enough space for what was necessary: a couch that had seen better years, a narrow table, a single lamp casting a soft, uneven glow in the corner, a stack of books, and a folded blanket where the boy slept when he was there. Everything in the room spoke of survival, not comfort. Naomi set her bag down carefully, moving through the space with quiet awareness. She checked the window locks out of habit, then placed a glass of water on the table, though she did not drink it. Small rituals repeated every night, because they created the illusion of control. She sat down slowly, her hands resting in her lap, her gaze unfocused for a moment before drifting toward her sleeve. She hesitated, then gently pulled the fabric back just enough to look not long, not closely, just enough to acknowledge what she already knew before covering it again, her breathing steady, but shallow, like she was measuring each inhale and exhale. Then, without thinking, her eyes moved to the empty space on the table where something could have been, where that card could have been, and for the first time the absence felt heavier than the weight she carried, because it meant she had walked away from something she did not fully understand, yet could not ignore. At the same time, across the city, Vincent stood in his office, the lights low, the windows stretching wide behind him. As he looked out over streets that never truly slept, a file rested open on his desk. Not thick, not complicated, just a few details gathered quietly, a name and address, a pattern of connections, nothing dramatic, nothing loud, but enough to confirm what he had already sensed. This was not random, this was not temporary, this was something that had roots, and those roots ran deeper than one moment or one night. Vincent closed the file slowly, his fingers resting on its edge as his expression remained unchanged, but his thoughts moved with precision. He did not rush decisions, he built them piece by piece until there was no room for error, and now the pieces were starting to form a shape, one that pointed in a direction he could not ignore. And as he reached for his phone, he paused just briefly, not out of hesitation, but out of clarity, because once he stepped forward, there would be no returning to silence. And somewhere in the quiet of her small apartment, Naomi sat alone, believing she had kept everything hidden, not knowing that the moment she chose not to reach for help was the moment someone else decided he would reach for it. Instead, morning did not arrive with relief. It arrived with routine, the kind that asks nothing and offers nothing in return. Naomi woke before the alarm, as she always did, her body trained to rise before the day could demand it. The apartment, still dim, the quiet pressing gently against the walls. She sat up slowly, letting the weight of the night settle into something she could carry, then stood and moved through the same motions, water running soft against porcelain, coffee brewing in a machine that hummed more than it worked, clothes chosen not for style but for function, long sleeves again, always long sleeves, even when the weather did not ask for them. She paused only once, standing in front of the mirror, her reflection steady, composed, the same face she showed the world every day, and for a moment her hand hovered near the drawer where she kept things she rarely used, documents, old photographs, reminders of a life that felt distant now. She opened it halfway, then stopped, closing it again without taking anything out, because looking back was not something she allowed herself anymore, not when moving forward required all her strength. Across the city, Vincent had already been awake for hours, his office filled with quiet activity that never reached the surface. A phone call, here a message there, information moving without noise, without attention. The file from the night before now expanded, not in size but in clarity, names connected, addresses confirmed, patterns traced with careful precision. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just truth laid out in a way that could not be ignored. He listened more than he spoke, his voice measured when it did cut through the silence. And when the call ended, he set the phone down slowly, his gaze fixed on a single detail that mattered more than the rest, a schedule, a routine, a point where everything intersected. And for the first time since he had seen her that night, his expression shifted, not visibly, not to anyone else, but enough to mark a decision, the kind that does not ask for permission, the kind that changes outcomes by simply existing. Back at the restaurant, the doors open like they always did, the same polished floors, the same controlled lighting, the same illusion of perfection. Naomi stepped inside on time, her posture unchanged, her presence seamless as she tied her apron and began her shift. There was no sign of hesitation, no trace of the moment that had almost broken something the night before. She moved through the early hours with quiet efficiency, greeting guests, refilling glasses, aligning plates, every motion exact, every interaction measured. And yet beneath that surface something had shifted, not outwardly, not in a way anyone could name, but in the small spaces between breaths, in the way her eyes lingered a fraction longer on exits, in the way her hand brushed against her sleeve, not to adjust it, but to confirm it was still there, still covering, still protecting. Vincent arrived later than usual, not announced, not expected. His presence felt more than seen as he crossed the threshold, the room responding in subtle ways, conversations lowering just slightly, attention shifting without understanding why. He did not look at her immediately, did not approach, did not interrupt the rhythm she had rebuilt. Instead, he observed from a distance, the same way he always did, but this time with purpose, not curiosity. The pieces were in place now, not all of them, but enough And as the afternoon light stretched across the windows, casting long reflections over the tables, Naomi moved through her section, unaware that the pattern she had lived inside for so long was about to be interrupted, not by force, not by chaos, but by something far more deliberate, something that had already begun the moment she chose to say she was fine. The shift reached its peak just as the sun dipped low enough to turn the windows into mirrors reflecting a room that looked perfect from every angle, conversations layered over soft music, glasses catching amber light. And Naomi moved through it all with the same quiet precision, as if she had never hesitated, as if nothing had ever threatened to break that rhythm. But tonight something beneath the surface was different, not visible, not loud, but present like a current running just below still water. Vincent stood near the far end of the room, speaking briefly with a man in a dark suit. The exchange short, controlled, a nod, a few words, nothing that would draw attention, yet everything had already been set in motion earlier that day, not through force, not through confrontation, but through structure, the kind that holds weight without raising its voice. Naomi approached table 14, balancing a tray steady in her left hand, her right arm close to her side. As always, the guests barely noticed her except to place orders and expect them to be fulfilled, which she did without error, without delay. And as she turned to leave the table, the front door opened, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to let in a shift of air that did not belong to the room. Naomi felt it before she saw anything. Her steps slowed by a fraction, her breath tightening slightly as her eyes moved toward the entrance. And for a second the world around her softened, not stopped, just distant, like sound traveling through water. Vincent noticed the change immediately, not because he was watching her every move, but because he had learned to recognize the exact moment when a pattern breaks. He did not turn his head right away, did not signal anyone, did not react in a way that would expose what he already knew. Instead, he continued his conversation, finishing it with calm precision, before stepping aside, his gaze finally lifting toward the door. A man stood there, not out of place to anyone else, just another presence, just another face in a city full of them. But Vincent did not look at the man, he looked at Naomi, and that was enough. Naomi set the tray down on the service station, her fingers lingering against the edge for a moment longer than necessary, her posture still composed, but her stillness deeper, now more intentional, as if movement itself required permission. She had not yet given. Vincent took a single step forward, then stopped, not intervening, not interrupting, allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, because control was not about acting first, it was about acting at the right time. The room continued unaware. A server laughed. Near the bar, someone raised a glass in celebration. A phone buzzed softly against a table, and in the middle of it all, two lines formed, invisible to everyone else, one that Naomi had been walking for years, and one that Vincent had just drawn, crossing paths in a way that could no longer be ignored. Naomi finally moved, not toward the door, but away from it, her steps measured, deliberate, heading toward the back hallway, the place where she could breathe, the place where she could disappear, if only for a minute. But Vincent was already in motion, now, not fast, not aggressive, just certain, his presence cutting through space, without sound, without resistance. And as he passed the service station, his hand brushed lightly against the counter, leaving something behind, not a card, not this time, but a quiet signal already understood by those who needed to understand. And in that moment the balance of the room shifted, not visibly, not loudly, but completely, because whatever had followed Naomi to that door had just walked into a space that no longer belonged to it. Naomi did not make it far into the hallway before she stopped, the sound of the dining room fading behind her, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than noise, her hand resting lightly against the wall as she steadied her breath, not panicked, not rushed, just controlled, the way she had learned to be when control was the only thing she could afford to lose. And outside the main room, the man who had entered did not sit down, did not ask for a table. His presence lingered near the entrance, scanning, not searching loudly, but waiting, the kind of waiting that carries expectation. Vincent stepped into the space between, without urgency, his pace, even his posture relaxed, as if nothing required immediate attention, and yet everything about him shifted, the air around him, conversations near the front slowed, not enough to draw alarm, but enough to be felt. The man's attention moved toward Vincent, instinctively recognizing something that did not need introduction. They stood a few feet apart, no raised voices, no sudden movements, just a quiet exchange of presence, the kind that decides outcomes before words are even spoken. Vincent spoke first his tone calm, almost conversational. "This is a private establishment," the words simple but layered with meaning. The man hesitated, not out of confusion, but calculation, as if measuring how far he could go without crossing a line. He could not see Vincent, did not move closer, did not repeat himself. He simply waited, and that waiting carried more weight than any command, because it left no room for misunderstanding. Behind them the staff continued their work, but slower now, more aware, eyes glancing, without staring, sensing that something had shifted without knowing what exactly. Naomi remained in the hallway, unseen, her body still, her attention fixed on the space just beyond the door where everything seemed to balance on something invisible. She did not step forward, she did not retreat, she listened, not for words, but for tone, for the kind of silence that tells the truth before anything is said. And in the dining room the man finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, as if trying to match the calm in front of him. "I am here for someone." Vincent's expression did not change, his gaze steady, his response immediate. "No one here belongs to you." The words landed without force, but they did not need it. The room seemed to hold its breath, not in fear, but in recognition, because something had just been defined, a boundary drawn, not loudly, not publicly, but absolutely. The man's posture shifted slightly, his certainty no longer as firm as it had been when he walked in, and Vincent took one step forward, not to close distance, but to establish it further, a subtle repositioning that changed everything around them. "You will leave," he said quietly, and this time it was not a suggestion, it was a conclusion, the kind that leaves no space for argument. A pause followed, not long, not dramatic, just enough for the weight of the moment to settle, and then the man stepped back, not defeated, not exposed, but redirected his path, turning toward the door the way it had come in, and as it closed behind him the room exhaled without realizing it. Conversations resumed, glasses lifted, music continued, as if nothing had happened. But Naomi knew better, because she had felt the shift before anyone else, and now she understood something she had not allowed herself to believe before. The line she had been walking alone for so long had just been crossed by someone who refused to let her carry it any further. And in the quiet that followed, Vincent did not look toward the hallway, did not call her name. He simply turned and walked back into the rhythm of the room, as if restoring balance was just another part of the night. But the silence he left behind carried a different meaning now, one that would not disappear once the lights went out. The night did not end the way it began, because something invisible had shifted, and once that kind of shift happens, it does not return to where it was. Naomi remained in the hallway for a moment longer after the door closed, her hand still resting against the wall. Her breathing steady, but different now, not lighter, not yet, but no longer as tightly held as before. She stepped back into the dining room, slowly, her eyes adjusting to the warm light again, the familiar rhythm returning around her plates, moving, voices rising just enough to fill the space. And yet everything felt changed, not in the room, not in the people, but in the way she stood within it. She moved back to her station, picking up a glass, aligning it with the others, her hands precise as always, but this time there was a pause, a fraction of a second, where she did not rush to the next task, where she allowed herself to exist in the moment without immediately shrinking into it. Vincent was already across the room, speaking quietly with a staff member, his tone, even his posture, unchanged, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. And that was the difference. He did not make a scene, he did not look for acknowledgement, he simply restored something that should never have been taken, and then stepped back as if it had always been that way. Naomi watched him, only briefly, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to understand something she had not understood before. This was not about control, not about power, not about fear. This was about a line that had been drawn in a place where no one had ever drawn one for her before. Later, as the final guests left and the lights softened again, she returned to the service station, and this time there was something waiting, not in the center, not displayed, but placed carefully near the edge where only she would notice. An envelope, simple, unmarked, her name written in clean, deliberate handwriting, Naomi Carter. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers brushing lightly against the paper as if confirming it was real. When she opened it, there was no message, no explanation, just a key and a small card with an address and a time. Nothing more, nothing less. Her eyes lingered on the key for a moment longer than expected, the weight of it unfamiliar, not heavy, but significant, because it did not ask for anything in return, it did not demand, it did not pressure, it simply existed as an option, something she had not been given in a long time. Across the room, Vincent prepared to leave, his jacket already in place, his steps measured as he moved toward the exit. He did not stop beside her, did not offer reassurance, did not explain his actions, because he understood that dignity was not something you hand to someone, it is something you make space for them to take. And just before he reached the door, he paused for a fraction of a second, not turning, not speaking, just enough for the silence to carry meaning, and then he stepped out into the night, leaving the door to close quietly behind him. Naomi stood there alone in the soft glow of the restaurant, the key still in her hand, the room around her calm, unchanged, and yet everything within her felt different, not resolved, not finished, but open, like a door she had never believed she could walk through. And for the first time, she did not pull her sleeve down right away. She let it rest where it was, her posture straight, her gaze steady. And in that quiet moment, without words, without witnesses, something returned to her, not loudly, not suddenly, but completely. And that day the world remembered what dignity looks like.